Alright, hey guys, Alex here with another cup of coffee video. Recently some people have been pointing out my good luck with getting low-grade cards that happen to be in really good condition. And I've even had some people ask for tips and advice on how I do what I do. So I decided I was going to make this video, although to be honest I really hesitated to do it because I'm no expert and really I'm in no position to tell anybody anything. But I've decided to go ahead and give this a shot. I'm going to try to focus mainly on how I buy vintage cards and my thought process as to how I approach it, and I'm just going to leave it at that. But I do honestly hope that this encourages somebody out there who never thought they'd be able to afford a decent looking copy of a card that they really want. Okay, so when it comes to graded cards, one of the standard approaches for collecting vintage has been to collect at a grade that matches the decade in which the card was released. So for example, if the card was released in the 1950s, you go after a 5. If it's from the 1960s, you go after a 6, and so on. Now of course you could go for a higher grade, but this method is considered the collector's grade method. And this is the approach that I loosely used in building the Bowman Color set. The trouble starts when the card that you're trying to collect has unique qualities. Maybe it's a Hall of Fame player. Maybe it's a big name like Mickey Mantle or Willie Mays. Maybe it's a high number card, and so therefore it's rare. But whatever the reason, you run into some mid-range graded cards that are just way too expensive. So when I reach this point, I only have a couple of options as a collector. I could either just decide not to get the card at all, hoping that maybe someday the price will come down, although it probably never will. Or I could compromise and try to get the card at a much lower grade and just live with the results of that. And I think most of us do this begrudgingly. It's because we associate cards that are graded a 1 or a 2, or cards that are just designated as authentic, with being in really rough shape. They're wrinkled, they're scuffed, they're torn, they've been run over and chewed up. Sometimes they hardly retain any of the qualities of a baseball card at all. And then when we buy a card like this, we try to justify it to ourselves because we feel like we have no other choice. And honestly, that's kind of true sometimes. As a collector, you have to make compromises in order to get a card that you want in your collection. But that being said, I do believe that there's a way to do this where you're not just compromising, you're also able to get a card that actually looks good, that you're actually proud to own. To do this, I play the long game. Now, what's the long game? The long game is taking the time to get to know the card that you're trying to acquire. It means creating a saved search on eBay, for example, and observing that card over a period of weeks, months, even years. Watching the examples come in and out of circulation, learning the specific condition issues for that particular card, watching the prices, and just learning all the ins and outs. In doing this, you begin to absorb everything you'll need to know about the card that you want to acquire, and that's going to help you make a good purchase. It's amazing how much you can learn even in just a couple weeks' time. And eventually, you're going to be able to spot a good bargain when you see one. Generally speaking, I'm looking for a low-grade card that is missing the usual condition issues and that is priced reasonably. Those are the basic factors that I'm looking for, and when I see them, that's when I want to pull the trigger. But in order for this method to work, I have to change the way I look at grading. Now, there are a lot of different opinions out there about grading. Some of us love it, some of us hate it. We can all acknowledge that it's a flawed system. But in my opinion, the main reason that grading is worthwhile is because it's attempting to establish a standard for which we can judge the value of a card. We've all heard the phrase, buy the card, not the grade. But we don't say that because the grade doesn't matter. The grade totally matters. It's a great starting point towards figuring out what the condition of the card is. But it's by no means a perfect process. We just can't take the grade at face value. There are absolutely beautiful cards that have been given low grades. There are absolutely horrific cards that somehow have high grades, and there's all sorts of reasons why that's the case. But ultimately, I have to stop thinking that my collection has to be filled with cards that are graded as 5s, 6s, and 7s. Now, I've got to acknowledge that this method does not work across the board. There are plenty of 2s and 1s, and even some horribly mangled authentics out there that are as expensive as hell no matter what you do, and there's just no getting around that. But there are also plenty of big cards that can be found in good condition at lower grades. Now, how often are these low-grade cards in good condition that I'm talking about actually going to pop up over time? Well, of course it's going to depend on the card, but it's pretty safe to say that these types of cards will not show up that often. It may be weeks, it may be months, it may be years. When they do show up though, I want to jump all over that card. Now sometimes that's just not going to work out. Maybe I missed the auction. Maybe I wasn't ready financially to pull the trigger at that particular time, or somebody else just snagged it before I could. To me, that just means I'm going to have to wait even longer for another example of the card to pop up in the condition that I'm looking for. And I'm guessing that sounds pretty painful to a lot of you. Well, as I said, this is a long game we're playing. There's no rush. As we like to say, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. I'm in this hobby to enjoy it over time, and I'm not in a hurry to finish a collection or to get a bunch of cards that I end up regretting because I was too quick to acquire them, and as it turns out, I don't actually like them. Besides, as my good buddy G's Mikey says, there's always another card. You may not see the one you want for months or years, but there's always another card coming around the bend. So just wait. Now there's an alternative method that I haven't talked about yet, but I definitely wanted to mention, and this is especially useful if you're not feeling like you have a lot of patience, or if you're just not having any luck waiting around for those 1s or 2s in good condition, and that's to look for raw cards. Now looking for raw cards in the vintage world can make a lot of people nervous, and for good reason, but with a little research and finding the right seller, you should be able to buy some raw cards with some confidence and find the card in the condition that you like, ideally paying a lot less than you would if the card were already graded. So the cards that you're seeing in front of you here are among the last cards I needed to complete the 53 set, and I found these 3 at the National in 2019. All 3 of these cards were raw. I had a lot of fun going through lots of stacks of 1953 Bowman at various vendors while I was at the National in Chicago, and I came across these 3 cards. Each of these 3 cards, for me, met the condition issues that I was looking for, that I was just not finding when I looked for these cards already graded. I sent them into PSA, and I was really happy with the result, but this is another case of not really caring what the grade was, really excited to find the card in the condition that I wanted it in. I've mostly had post-war cards in mind with what I've been talking about here so far, but this also can apply to pre-war. I'm a pre-war collector, and in pre-war, grades definitely take on a much different meaning. You have to be much more open-minded when it comes to condition, but more on that later. There's no doubt that a huge part of this approach requires some serious patience. I often hear people make remarks about that, like, "Wow, man, you must have a ton of patience to wait that long just for a card." And there's always some admiration, but also some apprehension in what they're saying. They're kind of hinting that this method seems a little crazy to them, and that there's no way they would ever collect that way. And you know what? That's totally fine. Yeah, it is a little crazy, and it does require a lot of patience. And guess what? You don't have to do this. As we like to say, there's no wrong way to collect. But you know what? Looking at all these cards together, I kind of feel like this process totally works. In my opinion, the evidence speaks for itself. And I would also just add that there's a lot of gratification on the other end of this long game. because the amount of effort that you put into waiting for the right card pays off when you see that card finally added to your collection. It's not just having the card, it's being proud of the work that you put into selecting just the right one for your collection. One that meets whatever the conditions are that you set for yourself. Believe it or not, that's actually a lot of fun. Sure, sometimes collecting can just be thinking of a card and then jumping on eBay and surfing around and purchasing what you come across. But collecting can also be more of a process. We all know the first method is a lot of fun, but I've also discovered that there's a lot of enjoyment and reward in this method. Alright, I want to wrap this up by talking about vintage, and I also want to acknowledge those of you who collect raw cards and have probably been grinding your teeth throughout this entire video listening to me go on and on about graded cards and condition issues and all this stuff. Honestly, you're probably not even watching this video anymore. But anyway, I'm convinced that modern card collecting has us all looking at vintage the wrong way. We look at vintage cards and we subconsciously want the cards to be perfect, like they just came out of a pack. And it's no wonder. When you see a perfect looking card, yeah, it's a remarkable thing. But aside from the fact that those kind of vintage cards are extremely rare and very expensive, they're also somewhat unnatural. Vintage is vintage because it's old. It's aged. It's imperfect. It's lived a life. It comes from a time when people didn't wear gloves when they opened packs. And so there's nothing wrong with some rounded corners, or a little fading, or some paper loss, or some scuffing. All the cards you're looking at on this table most definitely have condition issues. I think they present really nicely, and I'm very proud of the work that I've done to track them down and gather them together here, but they are by no means flawless. And we can get caught up in worrying about wrinkles and creases and corners and forget to just appreciate what the card truly represents. But I have to say, for many of us, concerning ourselves with the condition of the card is just part of the process because it's a fun challenge. And I think there's room to create a standard condition for yourself when you're searching for cards that you're going to be happy with, even when you're looking at low-grade cards. All right. I hope this was interesting. I hope you found it worth your time, and I hope it may have even been somewhat helpful for some of you out there. Thanks for watching, and take care.